The argument that Amity laid out about what is essential to free, if you will, the economic playground runs directly through our first panel. Because nowhere are these essential elements more contested right now than the intersection of trade and national security. Moderating our first panel, titled Trade and National Security, the Eternal Debate, is Dominic Pino, editorial writer at the Washington Post and previously the economics editor at National Review, and one of the sharpest journalists covering trade policy today. Joining him is Dr. Donald Boudreaux, professor of economics at George Mason University and a prolific contributor to the well-known blog Cafe Hayek. Dr. Boudreaux is one of the most rigorous and unapologetic defenders of free trade in the country. And Dr. Erik Gartzke, professor of political science at UC San Diego and director of the Center for Peace and Security Studies, where his research on trade, conflict, and deterrence make him one of the leading scholarly voices on how economic ties shape the decision to go to war. Please join me in welcoming our panel.
All right. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for being here and spending the morning with us. Like Julia said, I'm Dominic Pino at the Washington Post, and before we get going, just a quick pitch for what we're doing at the Post. Our new mission on the editorial board since last year is free markets and personal liberties, and all of our coverage is geared towards those two pillars. And so, if you haven't read the Post in a while, I encourage you to check it out. I think you will like what you see. And subscribe if you are so moved. But today we're going to talk about free trade and national security, and we have two of the best people to do it. We'll turn it over to Don to kick us off.
Thank you, Dominic. I should point out, in addition to what Julia said about Dominic, he is also a graduate of George Mason University economics, and it's incumbent upon me to point that out. Dominic was a student of mine. It was a COVID semester, I think. Yeah, because we went online. Every spring semester, I teach a seminar on, I like the full title, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith. The 250th anniversary of which publication was just last month, less than a month ago. And even Adam Smith, this is even Adam Smith move by people who want to capture Adam Smith for the political left. Even Adam Smith said this. And it's true, even Adam Smith, as staunch a defender of free trade as he unquestionably was, had a national security exception to the case for free trade. Defense is more important than opulence, or words such to that effect. But even Adam Smith, in listing that exception, made clear that if protection in the name of national security is justified in particular instances, we should also recognize that it is an economic cost, not a benefit. And it's important to point out this simple, to me, obvious point, because it's not uncommon to hear a lot of people who petition in favor of higher tariffs on national defense grounds as saying something like, oh, and by the way, it's going to be great for the country. It's also going to enrich us. It's not. Even if we can agree that protecting Industry X in this way is unambiguously important and even necessary for national defense, we have to recognize that it's going to make the economy less wealthy than it would otherwise have been. It's important to point that out because once you explicitly recognize that protection for purposes of national defense has an economic cost, then what that immediately suggests is that not all protection for national defense is worthwhile. It can have a national defense benefit, but if there's an offsetting cost, then that cost has to be weighed against the benefit. And that cost is, by misallocating resources, over time the economy becomes less efficient. The economy becomes less wealthy. There's unquestionably a positive connection between the wealth of a nation, to use Adam Smith's phrase, and the ability of that nation's government to supply adequate national defense. And so by protecting industries today or a firm today on national defense grounds, it might have a benefit, but it has this offsetting cost. And that offsetting cost has to be reckoned into the picture. Now, it's extraordinarily difficult to do so. There's no question about that. How the empirics are carried out is a separate question, but we can't ignore it. And too often when I hear discussions of using protectionism on national security or national defense grounds, I never even encounter a recognition that there are these offsetting costs. And those offsetting costs must be recognized. And there is a related point. When you protect an industry, you necessarily make it less competitive. And what that means in our modern dynamic economy is you also necessarily make it less innovative. So let's say that we agree that industry X, the steel industry, the auto industry, you name the industry, is unambiguously important for national defense. We all 100% agreed on that. So we give that industry protection. Well, ironically, we make that essential industry less innovative. Because that industry is less subject to competition, that industry has diminished incentives to be innovative. Not just to allocate resources in a better way, to innovate, to come up with better products, to come up with new and better ways to produce outputs. And so by protecting an industry on national defense grounds today, you may promote better national defense today, but there is this trade-off that by making that industry less innovative, and again, by reducing the efficiency with which resources are allocated in the economy over time, by making that industry less innovative, going forward through time, that industry itself might turn from being a national defense asset into a national defense liability. I tell my students, 18-year-olds get this. And if an 18-year-old can get something, everybody should be able to get it. I tell my students, I say, look, suppose I promised you, and you believe me, suppose I said, look, don't worry about it. Don't worry. I guarantee you at least an A- at the end of the semester. How many of you would study hard? And they all, a handful raise their hand. I explain why they're wrong. Right? Of course. Well, if you're protected from competition, your incentive to stay on top of your game diminishes. And then there's the other obvious cost. As soon as exemptions to a case for free trade are given on national security grounds, then every industry in the country suddenly becomes essential to the national defense, at least in the eyes of the leaders and shareholders and workers in those industries. And so you have the cost of deciding, okay, which industry truly is essential to national defense, which industry is not essential to national defense. I do believe there is a national defense exception, but we should err on the side of being skeptical of national defense claims, and I would rather fail in any instance to protect an industry rather than to overprotect industries on national defense grounds. Because if we do that, then our economy becomes less innovative and less efficient over time. And then over time, we become much less able to defend ourselves. Let me just say one other point. It's more general about trade, but it has an impact on the national defense point. A term that I hate, and my dear friend Veronique knows this because I say it all the time. I hate the term supply chains. We hear it all the time. Well, there are these supply chains, and so this industry is at the end of a supply chain. This industry is important for national defense, and so it makes sense. Well, let's bring in that supply chain and have the entire supply chain more domestically located, so that we don't have to worry about the end product being subject to being captured by our enemies or being blockaded by our enemies. It's a nice image, but it's a completely misleading image. There are no supply chains in the modern economy. The modern economy is a gigantic supply web. Every output has inputs from any number, uncountably large numbers of different sources. And each of those inputs also have inputs from uncountably large numbers of sources. And they circle back on one another. So when we start to pull in, if the image is that we're pulling in a supply chain, well, steel's important and iron ore is important for for promoting steel, for producing steel, and this other product is important for producing steel. Let's pull all those in. You don't know what you're pulling on. You don't know what threads of the worldwide economic web you're messing with. And it very well could be that as you pull some of those supplies inward in order to protect industry A, you're denying essential inputs to some other industry in the economy that's also important for national defense, but you can't trace out the connections. The point is not, again, to deny that there is a national security exception. There is a national security exception. There is. I just think that when we talk about it, and certainly when people on Capitol Hill talk about it, there should be a lot more humility about what we can do to pursue that exception in an economically feasible way, and a way that actually does promote better national security over time. Thank you.
Thanks, Don. And Eric?
Oh, thank you so much. So I think our brief here is to spend 5 minutes reconciling an eternal debate. And that's challenging for many people, but especially for a community that usually has a monopoly on your time, which is academics, right? We don't have free markets, we have classrooms. And so you don't get a free market of ideas necessarily in a classroom. I hope I will stick to my time here. I'm going to try to pay a little bit of attention to that. But the first thing that strikes me about this community is that you're doing good, okay? And I very much believe that. But that makes me worried as an economistic political scientist, because doing good is not actually what political economy taught us people do. They do what's in their interest, right? And that the way to get good in the world is through incentivization, to create conditions in which people behave. This is Adam Smith's key point, right? They behave as if they're doing good even though they're selfish. Okay, so, but a free market is a public good. It benefits the community it serves, but it doesn't necessarily benefit equally the people, the actors in that. Firms don't want free markets. They want protection. They want conditions in which they get to sell things to people and others don't. And governments are the same way, as we see again and again. So in my world, what I'm dealing with is peace and international stability. And those are also public goods. And guess what? It doesn't take a whole lot of attention to the current events to see this. They're underprovided, right? So the question is, where do you get them and how do you get them a bit more, and under what incentive schemes can you see that governments are behaving as if they're doing good, even though they're simply following their own interests? What kinds of incentives lead to political stability and a relative decline in warfare? I was hoping I would have some, because I'm an academic, right? I need a PowerPoint, and last year I worked in the US government, so I've seen both sides of anti-competitive schemes now, right? I was hoping I would be able to show you this slide. This is a graph of the relationship between the amount of trade and on the vertical axis, the amount of disputes, warfare between two countries. And if you can't see that relationship, it's because it's almost not there, okay? Unless you have wonderful, my daughter has 20/15 eyesight. She might be able to see this. But there's a little tiny curve down here at the very, very high end. Basically, the Dutch and the Belgians don't fight each other a little bit because of trade. But the amount of trade between Belgium and the Netherlands is enormous. It's more than 100% of their GDP. And most bilateral trade relationships do not look like that. Okay? So one of the problems here is that the very intuitive notion that you get from Smith, from Kant, from a number of Enlightenment thinkers about how if you have more trade, then there's an incentive to have less war. Okay? And that's what most people, I think, have in their heads. There's a number of problems with that, and I'm happy to share my notes, but I will go over time if I even attempt to cover all these. But I'll cover one important one, and that's that the nature of war is misspecified in that argument. Fundamentally, War is not a distributional process, more of something, less of another. It's an informational process. What two countries or two companies in a war do is they have different expectations about how a costly and inefficient way to resolve their differences will benefit them. Okay? They're engaging not in a public good, but in private pursuits in a setting in which they know the public good is being diminished. Nobody who's honest about war will tell you it's good for people, right? We break stuff and we ruin lives and we kill people. So it is a loss of social welfare. But the reason why countries and even individuals engage in warlike activity on occasion is they think privately, personally, they'll end up better off. We'll win the war, and that'll be good for us. But that can't be true ecologically. Both sides can't win a war. Somebody has to lose. So what's causing the war is different and incompatible expectations about performance in the war. Just like when a labor union goes on strike, if they know that they're going to lose the strike and not get a raise, then that community, that organization should presumably, there might be private incentives within the organization, but the organization itself should not want to go out on strike unless they're going to get a raise. Okay? And so in economics, the study of wage negotiations deals with this problem, and we do the same thing at the international level. So how does raising the costs of something affect that? Well, it's not intuitive. Both sides want to raise the cost for the other side, and depending upon how that trade relationship works, you may very well get there. Long story short, there is a way in which trade reduces conflict. There's two. One is it can be used as a proxy for warfare. So a lot of times we see anti-competitive economic activities that are kind of a substitute for shooting at each other, right? You impose sanctions to get somebody to behave the way you want to instead of using a gunboat. Now, those are both things that are socially not good, but one arguably is a little bit less not good than the other, okay? And the other way in which it changes things, and I think this is the most dramatic, is it changes people's incentives within societies for how they behave. A long time ago, if you wanted to get rich, the most straightforward way to do that was to be the buddy of the king, and what the king would do would be engage in robbery. They'd steal from somebody to give to you, and that's how you got rich. And then we changed the world. There was always some of this going on, but it got more and more important, and Adam Smith saw it and wrote about it, which was the way to get rich from the 18th century onward was really to engage in this mechanism of capitalism, and to the point that we cared less and less about being the king's buddy, and we cared more and more about having good ideas and having the autonomy from the state to be able to function. And when you get to that point, domestically and internationally, you no longer want the state to step in and make you rich. You might want the state to step in and stop making you poor, but you're a little bit less eager to go on campaign with the king to make money. And that's the world we live in today. One of the scary things for me right now is to see some leaders backtracking on this and being nostalgic and thinking that you get rich by stealing people's stuff, which is really not the way you get rich in the modern world. You get rich in the modern world by having good ideas and implementing them. I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
This is great. This is great. Erik's talking about incentives. Don's talking about trade-offs. We're doing economics up here, guys. This is wonderful. So building off of those ideas, how do we get the incentives right for policymakers to make and evaluate trade-offs well? Because one of the problems that we have, I think, is we've seen shifts in that over time. From historically, it was Congress that was in charge of determining trade policies, and then Congress realized it has big incentive problems because every district has industries that it would like to protect, and it led to all kinds of corruption. And so what Congress did is they said, well, okay, we will give we understand that having a national trade policy is good, and it would be better if it was less restricted, and so we are going to give that power to the executive branch, because the executive branch doesn't have to deal with all those districts and all those annoying things, and they will work to lower trade barriers. And they did that for a couple decades, and now we're seeing it come exactly the other way, where the executive is the one calling for more trade barriers, and that was true under the previous president and under this one. And it's Congress saying, actually, we don't think that would be a good idea, and they sort of refused to vote on this question because they know that it wouldn't pass. So I think it's an example of how incentives have changed over time for the actual people making the decisions about where those trade restrictions should be. How should we think about this going forward?
So, most of you have probably heard of this gentleman, but he's a hero of mine. It's Cordell Hull. He was the Secretary of State under Franklin Roosevelt. He was from Tennessee. He was called the Tennessean Cobden, after Richard Cobden, the English free trader who successfully campaigned to overturn the English Corn Laws in 1846. And Hull, although he understood the basic economic case in favor of free trade, his main motivation was he believed that the freer was trade, the less likely countries were to go to war with each other. And so after seeing the calamity of Smoot-Hawley, Hull is FDR's Secretary of State. Behind the scenes, and then increasingly in front of the scenes, Hull works to get the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act passed in 1934. And that's what you're talking about, Dominic. That was the act that finally took from Congress, well, Congress didn't take from Congress. Congress delegated to the executive branch the authority to negotiate trade tariff reductions, and Congress got to vote up or down on those. And it was quite explicitly understood at the time by members of Congress, in addition to Cordell Hull, that their parochial interests worked against the interests of the country when it came to trade. Right? They had to protect the local producers in their districts, and they weren't going to do that on their own. And so by delegating this authority to the executive branch, we're able to move more toward free trade. You said it worked for a few decades. I think it worked longer than that. And so starting in the mid-1930s, we get a gradual reduction in average tariff rates. And then after World War II, we get the GATT, General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which later became the World Trade Organization in 1995. These all trace ultimately to Cordell Hull's ideas. And if it's not perfect, of course, but if you look at the entire post-war period, until around 2018, the average tariff rate has fallen. And there were some non-tariff barriers that offset those. But there's no question that trade became a lot freer over, from the 1947, even before that a little bit, but from 1947 until the first Trump administration. What Hull didn't recognize, or maybe he did, he discounted it, is, and I'm going to pay Donald Trump here a compliment, a genuine compliment. I think the man is sincere. Right? He's not doing this out of public choice, narrow special interest. He genuinely believes that trade is bad, tariffs are good, and that's the way to enrich the country. He's an old-line mercantilist, and he really believes the stuff. And so it's ironic that an institutional move to transfer tariff-making power from the parochial interests of Congress to the executive branch, where the interest isn't as parochial, when you have someone running the executive branch who is sincerely devoted to the idea of protection, not out of public choice motives, but out of genuine ideological conviction, then you get what we're experiencing today. Trade-offs. So I do think that the incentives worked for a while, but they're not working now.
Yeah, Erik?
I think one definition of idiocy is to repeat your mistakes, right? And unfortunately, sometimes that happens in politics. One of the takeaways.
Every once in a while, right?
Not modally. One of the first things we teach PhD students is that economists tell you how the world should work in societies, and political science explains why it doesn't work that way, right? So we won the Cold War not because we got better protection than the Soviet Union. The Soviets were really good at protection. They'd shoot people if they were trading blue jeans, okay? Unless they bribed them, and then it was okay. But we won the Cold War because we out-innovated the other side. They stole all our ideas, but they couldn't execute on those ideas as quickly as we could, even though we had to invent them in the first place. We are not going to win this second Cold War by protection. We're going to win it by out-innovating the Chinese. And that's a very daunting thing because the Chinese are better at innovating than the Soviets were during the Cold War. But I'm an optimist. They are centralizing their economy. They are drawing in and moving back from free market principles in order for the leadership to better control the economy. And one of the effects of that will be, it already is they're suppressing innovation. The market share of state-owned enterprises in China has been growing over the last 2 decades for a variety of reasons that we don't want to go into here. But I would say that what we could learn from our past, which we don't do very well, is that innovation is the driver of so many good things in society, including security. It's our innovation in a variety of sectors that have been fed into the national security that's made the U.S. such a powerful actor. It's not protection.
Yeah, and it's always tempting, I think, for policymakers to look at a country like China and say, well, you know, they're bad for all sorts of reasons, human rights reasons, you know, people don't have freedom of speech, freedom of religion, that's all bad. But you do got to hand it to them because they've got strong leaders who can come in and do what's in the country's interest, and they can just make it happen. Whereas here in Washington, D.C., it takes forever to do anything. It has to go through 2 parts of Congress. All the Congress people fight each other. All these interest groups are annoying, and they create all these problems, and everything's just super slow. And you know, if we could just be a little bit faster, just a little bit more like the Chinese, not totally, right? We still like the human rights, we still like the freedom of speech, but we want to go just a little bit down that road. First of all, why do you think that's so tempting? And second, why does it not work?
Nobody likes freedom, right? We don't really like it. It's messy. The archetype of the unattractive aspects of politics is Congress. When Congress is operating well, it's a free market of ideas and different positions, and it's chaos. And it's fruitful when it's that way. One of the problems right now is we've oligopolized politics in the United States. We've reduced the amount, you're in one camp or you're in the other, okay? And it becomes more difficult to be, I mean, there are the Rand Pauls and other people out there that are kind of charting their own course, but they're rare because it's very hard for them to operate. They're expected to join an alliance. And when you do that, you reduce the degree to which you're autonomous, you reduce the degree to which you can be an engine of innovation and ideas and say, hey, what about this? So I think one of the things that's really important is that we try to break up that the hegemonic duopoly of parties. The thing historically, the United States had very weak parties. The parties were just a mild brand saying, if you don't think anything else, you might as well, right? But like, for example, during Jim Crow, which wasn't the best period in history, but Democrat could mean very different things depending upon where you were in the country. So today, we have a majority party in Congress that thinks that the right thing for Congress to do is to cede its power to somebody else, which is not what Congress is supposed to do. And I don't think it's been healthy for the country.
One of the many things that amuse, there's a whole, countless things to amuse one about the current trade debate. But one of the amusing things is the following. People will look at what the Chinese do because, you know, President Xi he's got a lot more power than even President Trump has. And so the thugs who run Beijing, you know, they can pretty much implement their will much more so than the Leviathan here in the Potomac can. And so a lot of Americans, pundits and politicians, will look at some Chinese economic move. Oh, they have industrial policy. And people get scared, we Americans get scared at that industrial policy. Well, if you know any economics, here's what you know. That industrial policy is going to make China poorer. I don't care how brilliant President Xi and his mandarins are. When they start allocating resources consciously, they're making that economy more poor than that economy would be if they let those resources be allocated by market forces. And so the unfortunately common reaction here is, well, we have to do what they're doing because we can't let them get a step up on us. And the proper reaction would be to China, you go for it, boys. Just keep doing what you're doing. Right? I mean, one of the best true national defense moves would be to persuade our foreign enemies that industrial policy and protectionism are really good means of growing their economy and providing national defense. And persuade them that's the way to go, and then just to let them go and do it. Because the more they do that, the poorer they become. And I like what Amity said earlier about play, and Erik just alluded to that. The strength of the economy and the strength of our national defense is ultimately determined by how innovative we are. Innovating in a market economy to come up with genuinely good products, genuinely new and effective means of production. And industrial policy only is an obstacle to that innovation and those economic improvements.
Yeah, one of the industrial issues that I think about sometimes is a lot of times when we talk about, especially national security, we're talking about trading goods. We're always talking about goods, and obviously goods are important, but the services sector is large, especially in the United States.
80%.
Yeah, especially in the United States, but in general it's very large. The U.S. has a services trade surplus, by the way, not that it matters, but the U.S. does have a services trade surplus.
It matters if you're in the service industry.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And so how do we think about those more modern industries, things like computing, things like AI? How do we think about those in a world of national security? Because I feel like oftentimes our go-to examples are steel or building airplanes, and those things matter. But what about those less tangible things that also matter for national defense?
Well, very, very briefly, you cannot attract resources into an industry without attracting resources out of other industries. Right? And so even if we all agree that steel is important for national defense, the resources that we attract into that industry through protectionism or industrial policy are coming from elsewhere. Some of them are going to come from industries, either directly from service industries or industries that help support service sector industries. And this is one of the things I had in mind earlier when I talked about the supply web. When more resources are attracted into producing tangible things, merchandise, we don't know how many service sector workers are going to lose their jobs. How many fewer people are going to be attracted into the ideas industry? And then what are we going to lose in the future because we have fewer people in the ideas industry? Once again, it's impossible to know the details ahead of time. If any of us could, we'd all be trillionaires because we can understand things that are predict the future. But that reality is one that should, I think, be better kept in mind when people so glibly talk about, oh, well, that's industry's important for national defense, let's do it. And this obsession with the goods trade deficits that the current administration has does inevitably undermine our strength, which is in the services industries, because that's where most of the ideas are.
The most important innovation in national security is in the informational space, broadly speaking. The reason why the U.S. dominates militarily is because it's figured out a way of war that capitalizes on information, intelligence, communication, sensors, that the rest of the world envies. Why would we want to get rid of that? Why would we want to give that up? On a purely national security basis, that's our comparative advantage. A word that, for example, should ring with this community because Bastiat was one of the innovators of ideas about comparative advantage. It makes relatively little sense for China to invest heavily in the development of robots when they have a huge still untapped labor force, and yet they're doing it. It makes relatively little sense for us to pound big chunks of hot things into little widgets when we have a huge labor force that's already oriented to and talented at informational processes. And another word that came up previously, supply chain. The area of profit in the supply chain is not making the widgets. It's in figuring out how to make them better. That's why Apple Computer is a great big company, not because it's able to press aluminum and other parts into something that we all carry in our pockets. It's figuring out how to make the thing that is the most profitable part of the supply chain today. It's the most impactful part of the national security supply chain, or what military folks call the kill chain. So that's what we need to prize and emphasize, and we have. And again, the trick isn't to have national security or government officials figure these things out. It's to leave it alone so that the private sector can figure it out, which they have been. That's what was happening. That's the history of economic and military affairs in the past 50 years.
There should be a good French term for that. Laissez-faire.
Yeah, no. If you look
I speak American. That's called free market.
and if we look at the United States historically too, where the U.S. has really succeeded in wars and in defense, it's not because we have tougher people than the other side. And it's not to say our soldiers aren't tough people. They absolutely are, but they always have been. And every country has tough people that fight wars. And the ultimate thing that separates the U.S. and separates more advanced countries from others is our ability to manage and to use information effectively in wars, to be in the right places at the right time, to move supplies where they need to be. And that's, our military heroes are people like Dwight Eisenhower, whose great competence and genius was in management. And he was able to pull off D-Day in a way that wouldn't have been able to if the only thing we were focusing on was building stuff and being tough. Because the Germans built a lot of stuff and they were tough too, but the U.S. was able to be more effective in the way it used the information. Yeah.
The German economy was a train wreck. The propaganda about their economy was excellent. It was so good that in the post-war period, British socialists pointed to Germany, Nazi Germany, and said they were doing it right. They copied everything, and that's why they had a huge economic downturn in the 1960s. There's always an incentive in pretending you're doing it right when you're in charge, right? That doesn't mean that you need to buy the propaganda. One of the mistakes the U.S. keeps falling into, and is in right now, is we let our adversaries turn contests of capabilities into contests of will. It turns out that there isn't a global scarcity of tough guys, right? There isn't a global scarcity of people who are willing to die for their country. There is a global scarcity of people who know how to do it well and not have to die for their country. And so the U.S. is very, very successful militarily when we're competing against capabilities. We can break your stuff better than you can break our stuff. And if you saw the first week of the war against Iran, that's what was happening. Where we're going to fall short is when we move from breaking people's stuff into converting them into our way of thinking, right? And this is what's happened in the last 2 weeks of the war. It's about trying to get the Iranians to agree to adopt positions in the world that we prefer. We can't make them do it. We can only hurt them and try to get them to be there. Well, that's a contest of wills. Who's more willing to suffer? Who's more willing to make to make a sacrifice for their ends. We did this with the Iraq War. We bombed Saddam's cities and his assets, his resources, and said, there, we've broken a lot of your stuff. Will you concede and give us what we want? And Saddam said, I don't care. I'll build it again after the war's over. We could only prevail by invading, and we have a similar problem today. We've let our adversaries turn our contests into tests of wills, who's willing to suffer more, instead of tests of capabilities, who's better able to break the other party's stuff.
I would say, I don't think you use the term, but it's an unsexy word, but people don't appreciate just how important it is in all walks of life, including in the military. It's logistics. It's not sexy. And I may have my details wrong. I don't remember them all. Amity would know better than me, but she mentioned William Knudsen earlier, who went on to become a high-level executive for General Motors. He then entered he became a government official during World War II. And I believe he was so successful because of his experience at GM, he had all this logistical knowledge, and he was able to help the U.S. military. He was able to apply that to help the U.S. military perform better during the war. And so this is one example of how when you allow industry to develop in a free market, you get the best processes, the best ideas, and you can't anticipate ahead of time just which ones are going to be important in the event of military need, but you can bet that when military need arises, those cutting-edge ideas, cutting-edge knowledge, those are almost surely going to be handy in the event of military hostilities.
Yeah, one of the questions from the audience gets at something I think is important, and you hear it a lot, and it's difficult to think through, I think, which is that, the U.S. can believe all it wants about free markets and free trade and all of these wonderful things, but our adversaries don't believe those things, and the Chinese don't believe that, the Soviets didn't believe that before them, all sorts of countries around the world don't believe those things, and yet we're all in the same global economy, and so how do we think about competition in a free market with unfree countries?
It's a darn shame that free trade is not embraced worldwide. But that doesn't mean that if this is a trite point to make, at least among economists, but I believe it sincerely. Yes, countries A, B, C, and D, they don't practice free trade. They make themselves poorer as a result of that. And by the way, it hurts their ability to do national security. That is no excuse for us to follow suit. Well, let's us make ourselves poorer just because they're making themselves poorer. It makes no logical sense. It certainly makes no economic sense.
I'd put what I see as a critical caveat here. Remember that free trade is one of those public goods things. It's good for the community it serves. That doesn't mean that individuals in that process want to follow that, right? We have criminals in a free society. We need some regulation to take those people who aren't playing the game in the fair way and rein them in a little bit so that everybody else can do okay. You want an ultimate free market? Get rid of the police, right? Because those are market actors too. They're intervening in the market, and their comparative advantage is mugging you. So let them do it, right? No, they're not playing the game in a legitimate way, even though it is a laissez-faire way, right? And China's been cheating on the global system. They've been exploiting the openness and free market orientation of the West, and saying, what's good for us is for us to sell to you, but you not to be able to sell to us. And I think it was completely legitimate. It's a bipartisan thing to push back against China. What drove me to distraction was the new administration came in and said, we've been telling you China's been cheating on the global free market economy, right? That they're not liberal. We are, and they're taking advantage of us. And so what we're going to do is we're going to impose sanctions on Lesotho and the Canary Islands and everyone, which to me is bizarre and super counterproductive. That China was the problem. It is the problem. And we need to do something about an important actor who's not playing the game in a legitimate and fair way. And we could build a consensus internationally around that. We were building it. Much of Europe now sees it, right? And we could very much continue that process, but we've stumbled badly by losing sight of the, losing sight of the ball and losing an initiative in the game, because now the Chinese can point to the fact that we've imposed tariffs on everybody.
I kind of disagree. I think when other countries, including China, impose trade restrictions, they're mostly mugging themselves. It's true, it has negative impacts on us, but they're mostly mugging themselves. And it's unfortunate. I feel sorry for the Chinese people. But I don't see any reason why we should retaliate and say, well, you're mugging yourself, we're going to mug ourselves in equal proportion. China does raise special problems. I'm not saying that there shouldn't be particular reactions to some of the things that are done in Beijing, but the mere fact that the Chinese try to export more and import less, which means the Chinese insist upon sending us stuff and receiving fewer things from us, which seems to be good for us, that's unfortunate for the Chinese people. It's not unfortunate for us.
So one of the ways that China has innovated is they've stolen ideas from the rest of the world. I worked last year for a, a Department of Defense organization that I'm not supposed to mention publicly. And its job is to try to stop China from stealing technology from the West. It has other jobs as well. We failed at that, right? The horse is out of the barn. And now the question is whether the Chinese are going to be able to exploit that theft, which is not free market behavior, in the free market, right? So if somebody robs your house and steals all your stuff, should they then be able, once they've done it, should they then be able to go to the local pawn shop or farmer's market or whatever and sell your stuff because, hey, it's a free market, right? I think that we need to be able to intervene in markets occasionally to stop violations that occur prior to the market at a stage in which we are assuming that everyone's playing the game legitimately, but some are not.
Yeah, we'll say we have a whole panel on China coming up, we will be looking at that more later on. One thing that you've said a couple times, Eric, is that peace and security are public goods and that they're underprovided and undervalued. How do we? Some from the audience asks, how do we determine that? How should we think about whether those things are undervalued, and how do we know that?
I'm making a theoretical assumption that I think is not controversial in this community. It stems from classical political economy, that there are these things called public goods, right? We think about them, like, for example, pollution or roads or anything like that. Security is another public good. It's well recognized in the literature. I don't want to bore you with all the details. The classic way to provide these is to have a hegemon, one actor that has an encompassing interest. Think of a company town, right? The company owns the whole town, so they pave the roads and they provide public goods and so on. They have a park, whatever it is. Okay. The problem moving forward is that the hegemon is declining. We're the hegemon, and where we used to be 50% of the world's economy, now we're 25. We ain't going to be 50 again sometime in the future. So how do you provide public goods in a setting in which there's no one actor that has an encompassing interest? And the classic answer for that is you build communities, like this one, that can act socially, collectively, to achieve that goal. We have communities that have been established. We could use different ones or whatever, but they're not popular right now, especially in the United States. Organizations like NATO and like the United Nations. There could be other alternatives. One of the other alternatives is to let the Chinese do that. I'm not a big fan of that. It's not an economic logic fundamentally. It's a consumer logic. At the end of the day, the free market gives us resources which we then expend for our own welfare and livelihood in different ways. And we can have different opinions about, you like chocolate ice cream and I like vanilla, whatever. Okay. I don't prefer living under Chinese hegemony to living under American hegemony. And most of the world actually feels the same way, or at least has historically. I think that's one of the things we bring to the table that we could continue to bring. We've lost sight of that, especially in the current administration. Americans don't understand how this enterprise benefits them, and that's something that we have to grapple with as a society. And I think we could potentially come to a better understanding.
Yeah, another question from the audience, I think it's at a really good point. They say, isn't access to goods critical for national security? What's really important? Access being the key word there. Why do we assume that we have to make it ourselves to ensure access? And I think this is a really good point, because we all know the saying, don't put all your eggs in one basket. And we all understand why that's a smart thing to do. We all understand the idea of diversifying a portfolio of investments, because that's a good idea to make sure if one thing goes wrong, you have other things to balance it out. But for some reason, when we talk about production, and especially production for defense, we say, no, we should put all of our eggs in one basket, our country, and we should make sure our portfolio has no diversification, no redundancy from any other countries, because we have to make it all here. Why do you think that basic intuition people have in every other area seems to break down when we think about this?
I'm biased. It's a professional bias. I teach mostly 18-year-olds Econ 101. And so my view of the world is that a lot of the policy problems we have is just failure to understand basic economics. It's failure to understand that there are trade-offs. So yes, of course, if you're going to fight a war, if you're going to do anything, you need goods. That doesn't mean, as you say, we have to produce them ourselves. But what a lot of people, here comes the Econ 101 failure, or the failure to understand Econ 101. Say, well, okay, steel is important for national defense. True enough. You can't fight a war without access to heavy metals. So let's produce more steel. Great, we produce more of our own steel. But what are you producing less of? You're producing less of other things, some of which are goods. And so the question is not, or the option before us is not, are we going to produce more of our own goods ourselves or fewer? The question is, are we going to, which of the goods that we produce more of are we going to produce more of? And which things, including goods, are we going to produce less of? That trade-off is unavoidable. And most people don't think that far. They think steel is important for national defense. We should produce more of it ourselves. End of story. And as Deirdre McCloskey says, you can't leave the play after the first act and think you know what's going on. You got to stay for the whole thing. And most people don't stay for the whole thing.
Yeah.
Supply chains are important in lots of worlds. In the military, you end up calling them logistics, but they're basically supply chains. There's a lot of talk in the news recently about ordnance expenditure and concern that do we have enough missiles and so on. But the debate is about thousands instead of millions. If you compare Ukraine, the battlefield in Ukraine to the battlefield in Iran, the number of projectiles that are being expended is 2 or 3 magnitudes of order less. And in Iran. We're expending hundreds of missiles and they're expending dozens of missiles, as opposed to the Ukrainians expending hundreds of thousands of artillery shells and the Russians expending millions of artillery shells. Okay? So it's a fundamentally different logistical chain. It has its own problems and challenges, but it's a very, very different world. And that's largely a function of the fact that the input that's abundant in the US case, that's rare in the Ukrainian case, is information. We're fighting a 21st century war, they're fighting a 20th century war. Now, people are making a big deal about drones, but essentially the drones are a different way of delivering an artillery shell. Same difference. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, sure. Another question we got on incentives. Staying on that theme, how can we positively or negatively incentivize innovation by firms that are critical to national defense? So what can we do to get those incentives better so that they're doing what they should be doing, or what are mistakes that we've made to make those incentives worse?
I think a mistake is to protect firms from competition. You don't give firms greater incentives to innovate and become more efficient by protecting them from competition. It does the opposite. It looks like that, well, okay, well, you're behind a protective wall, and so I trust you to go off and now become more competitive. That's just not the way human nature works. How to do it, it's a difficult question. One answer, I mean, I suppose if I had to choose between tariffs, protection, and subsidies, I would choose subsidies. But you get the same problem. You get very much close to the same problem there. You're subsidizing the firm. The firm then can become lazy, become inefficient. The actual direction of what the firm does is influenced by the nature of the conditions under which the subsidies are granted. I think in the long run, the best incentive is to allow markets to be as free as possible. That throws up as much competitive pressure as possible. We have as many ideas blooming as possible without any being subsidized or protected. And in the long run, I think it's the best we can do.
The way to innovate in defense is to have a war. That's not necessarily something I'd recommend personally. But if you look at the portions of national security that are innovating heavily right now, the Europeans are learning a lot very quickly and improving because there's free market competition to sell stuff to Ukraine to kill Russians. And the Russians aren't improving as quickly because they're largely relying on their own industry to supply themselves. And their industry started out very, very, very inefficient because the brilliant thing that they did in the aftermath of the Cold War was they took the defense sector, the public sector, and they consolidated it into one or two very, very big companies. And those companies are exactly what you'd expect. They're exceedingly inefficient. Okay, so another area where there's a lot of innovation is in cybersecurity. And again, because it's a free-for-all, it's the Wild West, and nobody really knows the right answers, but there's a huge margin on getting better answers than the next guy. There are lots of companies competing. There's lots of innovation happening. So again, I'm agreeing with the other panelists and probably with most of you that fomenting competition. The real issue is not to figure out how to do this in the free market. It's to figure out how to do it in settings that are not naturally akin to the free market. And another 1960s economist, William Niskanen, made the point that, like, for example, in the bureaucracy, the best thing you can do oftentimes is to have lots of different agencies that compete with each other. But politicians are always trying to convince the public that they're doing good by consolidating these things back into a monopolist supplier of things. One thing I would recommend for all of you is to pay attention to your local political representatives, and whenever they start to say something like, hey, we need to get rid of waste, fraud, and abuse in government, by taking these three agencies and making them one, point out that it does the opposite in the private sector. When you have three companies and you make them one, you don't get more efficiency. You get a more profitable and inefficient company.
Yeah, and the competition too within the military even, right? So we were talking about this a little bit before we came out here, but it used to be more common that the different branches of the military would compete with each other for defense contracts and for supplies. And in the name of cutting back on waste, they consolidate a lot of this under the Secretary of Defense. And so now there's really one buyer for a lot of things in a place that there used to be, 4, 5, 6 buyers competing with each other. Can you talk a little bit about that, specifically with missiles that we were talking about earlier?
Yeah, so one of the most innovative organizations in the military sector is the U.S. Marine Corps. And in particular, in the cyber area, they're the kind of go-to group right now if you want to try something that's kind of off the cuff and new. And that they execute more quickly, they're more eclectic, they're outside the box thinkers. And I don't think that's because of cyber per se, but that's them in contact with cyber. The Marine Corps is what most countries would call an army. The Marine Corps is its own entity, about 10% the size of the U.S. Army. but maybe 20% of the combat power. So that a lot more punch per person than you get in a larger organization. And a big part of it is that they have to continually justify their existence. Every generation, there's somebody saying, do we really need the Marine Corps anymore? And the Marine Corps comes around and says, well, of course you need us, because we've reinvented ourselves and we can do things that nobody else does, because they're always under that, chopping block. So the prospect of, being hanged has a concentrating effect on any organization.
Anything to add, Don? No. All right. One of the questions that we look at in history is in World War II, the United States was able to quickly ramp up military production because we had a big peacetime industry. Could we do that today? And one of the things that, this is one of the things that I always think about when people ask this question is, we got to remember too that the starting point before World War II is that the United States had a very small military, whereas the starting point now is we already have the largest military in the world. So that's not to say that we don't need more things if an actual war happens. And like you said, innovation mostly comes from war.
Most expensive, not by manpower though.
Sure. Yeah. But our starting points are much different between those two examples. But how do we think about that in terms of being able to get production going in the event of a war?
So just very quickly, I mean, the World War II, I think, was won by American entrepreneurs, American innovativeness. The free market allowed these military goods to be produced quickly, a lot of innovation. I'm astonished, pleasantly so, at how robust the market economy is, how entrepreneurial the American economy continues to be, despite all the obstructions and beatings that it's subjected to. And so I suspect that if that market is left free, that it will step up to the plate if we need it. I'm not sure how the differences in the starting points will affect that, but I do think that if we get into serious military conflicts, it'll be U.S. entrepreneurs that win the war.
I think there'd be some pushback from the Russians, for example, on the claim that the U.S. won the Second World War. And the Chinese might also make a pitch that they had a little role in it, especially since they were fighting for almost a decade before the U.S. got involved. But if you look at logistics again and who made the stuff that let countries fight the war, the U.S. was supplying both Russia and China an enormous amount, full armies worth of weapons and equipment in its own right. So I think that's a legitimate pitch. The contribution of these other countries was in manpower and in casualties. The Russians had roughly 10 million casualties in the Second World War. We had several 100,000. So a huge disparity in if you think of inputs to a destruction process instead of a production process. Warfare is different today. And it's an open question if there's a prolonged war, how we would respond. But one of the things that I've been pitching here is that war today, 21st century war, is much more about information and much less about tangible goods. You use information to dramatically reduce the amount of productive. You don't have to build 100,000 artillery shells to kill a tank. You need one smart weapon. And so the logistical circumstance changes dramatically. It's one of the reasons why the U.S. can fight a war halfway around the world, because you can fit enough smart weapons in a C-17 Globemaster to supply an army. You can't do that with artillery shells. You're going to have to put them on a ship and sail them across the ocean for weeks, right? So it depends on what that war looks like. If it's a very long war, we may all be back to sticks and rocks, but as Einstein said. But for most of the wars that I think are realistic, we can already cover most of that with the kind of installed base. We just have to kind of start doing the spend a bit earlier, buying more missiles sooner. The good news is, if we go to nuclear war, we won't have to worry. Everything's covered up front. There's no additional expenses necessary. Yeah. So I'll leave it.
That's great. That's all we have time for, folks. Thank you so much for being here. And like I said, if you're interested in more of these China questions specifically, we'll have a whole panel on that coming up. So thanks so much.